So what's Zakar about? Well, here's the word. The first letter is Zayin with the kames vowel underneath, giving us the za sound. In the middle letter is kaf, giving us a ch sound, and there's a patah vowel beneath, giving us cha. Now the last letter is resh, which is the r sound at the end. Zakar. Now compare that with zamar, which we saw last time. The only difference is that middle letter. Zakar can be found 232 times in the Old Testament, and not usually in the context of worship, so it isn't included in the list of 7 words for praise that you sometimes see in books or on the internet. Reverend Strong gave it the number 2142 and lists the meanings as to remember, to recall, to call to mind, and to mention. Well, if Zakar means that, why are we covering it in a video about worship words? Well, firstly, it completes a list of 3 words in a passage we looked at in 2 previous videos, the ones for halal, go crazy, and yada, raise the hands, confess, give thanks. But also because remembering was a vital part of worship in the Old Testament, and when you think about it, it still is today. Okay, let's look at that passage we looked at before. It's 1 Chronicles chapter 16 and verse 4, and we're back in that foundational place, the tabernacle of David. I'm sure you know the story by now. The Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines. They sent it back, but the Israelites never put it back in the old tabernacle where you think it belonged. Instead it went to live first at Abinadab's place, where the then King Saul pretty much ignored it. Then David came to the throne, and after an unsuccessful attempt to bring it to Jerusalem, the ark went to live with Obed-Edom. Now they've looked up how to carry the thing without anyone dying, and David is finally bringing the ark to Jerusalem. They put it in a tent specially pitched for the purpose. Now David has allocated jobs to the Levites who were serving in the tent, and the verse goes, "He appointed some of the Levites to minister before the ark of the Lord, to extol, thank and praise the Lord, the God of Israel." And that's 1 Chronicles chapter 16 and verse 4. Now if you remember the second video in this series, that praise is halal, go crazy. In the 5th video we saw that thank is translated from yada, which if you remember is about confessing, acknowledging to God, reaching out to him. Now we find that the word translated in the NIV as extol is zakar. So it's extol, is it? Another praisey word. At least that's what the NIV has, to extol, thank and praise. Now the New American Standard Version has to celebrate and to thank and praise. New Living Translation has to invoke his blessings, to give thanks and to praise. The Old King James Version has to record, to thank and praise. Now that's a rememberish sort of word, so perhaps it means some of the Levites did the thanking and praising, while others wrote down what they were improvising so it could go into Sefer Tehillim, the book of Psalms. Now the New King James Version has to commemorate, to thank and praise. Now all the translations seem to be unanimous about thank and praise, the yada and the halal, even though we've looked at the broader meanings of those 2 words in previous videos, but they can't agree on how to translate zakar. I wonder why. Now I think the New King James Version actually has the closest fit with commemorate, because nearly everywhere else in the Old Testament, zakar means to remember, as Sir Reverend Strong said. For example, in Genesis 8, in the story of the flood, it says, "But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark, and he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded." And that remembered is zakar. Again, in Genesis chapter 40, when Mrs. Potiphar has Joseph thrown into prison, where he meets the baker and the cupbearer, he says to the cupbearer, "But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison." And that's Genesis chapter 40 and verse 14. Now that remember and also the mention are both zakar. And of course we know the story in verse 23, there's another zakar in the negative. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph, he forgot him. In a few places, zakar appears as a job title in a list of officials. For example, 2 Samuel chapter 8 verse 16. Joab son of Zeruiah was over the army. Jehoshaphat son of Ahilud was recorder. And that word translated as recorder is Zakar. These days perhaps we call him a secretary or even an archivist, someone who takes the minutes and looks after the records. Oh, and let's look at another related word, Azkarah. This is found 7 times in the Old Testament, 6 of them in Leviticus and once in Numbers. Here's one of them from Leviticus chapter 2 and verse 9. He shall take out the memorial portion from the grain offering and burn it on the altar as a food offering, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. And that word translated as memorial portion is Azkarah, a variant of Zakar. It's the ceremonially important bit of the offering which is offered to God by fire. So Zakar is all about memorials and all about remembering. Well, what's any of this got to do with worship and with our relationship with God? Well, the answer is a lot. If you've spent any time in the Old Testament, you'll be familiar with the times God says, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Then after the Exodus, he reminds them he's the God who brought them out of Egypt. In fact, the whole Passover ceremony, Aboda, remember that third video in this series, was God's way of getting the Israelites to remember this. In fact, the way the Seder is still carried out, the intention is for participants to feel they were there. The words go like this: in every generation we must tell the story and remember as if we too were slaves in Egypt. In every generation we must act as if we were the ones who have been freed. It's all about Zakar. Now look at Psalm 135, where verses 8 to 12 are even more Zakar. He it was who struck down the firstborn of Egypt, both of man and of beast, who in your midst, O Egypt, sent signs and wonders against Pharaoh and all his servants, who struck down many nations and killed mighty kings, Sihon king of the Amorites, and Og king of Bashan, and all the kingdoms of Canaan, and gave their land as a heritage to his people Israel. And there's a very similar section in Psalm 136. But you might think, well, what's Sihon or Og to us? That's all just Old Testament stuff, isn't it? When Jesus keeps the Passover, in Luke chapter 2, he says, and he took the bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, this is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. That's the Gospel of Luke, chapter 22, verse 19. And the same words are used in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 in Paul's account, this time in relation to the wine. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. And that's 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25. Well, we're in the New Testament now, so that word translated as remembrance is not the Hebrew zakar, but the Greek anamnesin. Now this is an interesting one because it's a double negative. Start with nisin, which is about remembering. It's where we get the word mnemonic, a mental trick to help you remember something like Richard of York gave battle in vain for the colours of the rainbow, or lefty loosey righty tighty, or spring forward fall back. Then you add an A on the beginning to negate it, and you've got amnesin, from which we get the word amnesia, a loss of memory, forgetting. Then you add an on the front of that to negate the negation, and you have anamnesin. That's also come through to English, albeit a bit technical. Anti-vaxxers look away now. When you have a booster vaccine to increase your immunity to a disease, the way your system reacts is called the anamnestic response. Now, anamnesin is translated as remembrance, but it's actually a double negative, so you could just as well translate it as not fail to remember, which rather emphasizes the point that there is such a thing as failing to remember, amnesia, and that we should make sure we don't do that, anamnesin. So every communion service is an anamnesin in Greek, or a zakar in Hebrew. And of course it's even wider than that. In the Old Testament, Zakar was more than just the Passover and the Exodus. It was Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. It was Moses and Joshua. It was Sihon, Og, Balaam, Balak, Jael and Sisera, the return from exile, and everything else God had done in history to demonstrate his love and faithfulness to the Israelites. Likewise for us, anamnesin is more than just the communion service. What has God done in your life, in the life of your church, in the life of the church through the centuries? How has he led you and guided and grown you over the years? Do you keep a spiritual journal? A lot of people do, and that's all about Zakar too, anamnesin, remembering what God has done in your relationship with him, in his coming as a man to save the world, in his dealings with his people over the centuries. Zakar, anamnesin, do not fail to remember. We've nearly finished with the Old Testament worship words and even taken a step into the New. And there's just one more Hebrew word I want to look at in this series, kabod. And we'll also be slipping into the New Testament to look at the Greek equivalent there, doxa. See you next time.